It is Wednesday, I think, and we are ready to get going. All our jurors are here. County Commission is happy enough right now. Mr. Rucker, good morning. Anything from the state before we get started?
Good morning. I think Ms. Connery has a very interesting announcement regarding our...
The state rests. I'm ahead of you by a few weeks. Okay. Ms. Connery, what is your very interesting, you and Mr. Samuel have rekindled the friendship?
I think so.
We'll find out. I don't
I'm
know.
waiting on the official word. I don't want to, but it looks like I was able to, with a lot of help, get something that maybe Mr. Samuel is okay with. It's a very short clip, and what we did is just redacted to the defendant's statements only, and we did that for both audio and video statements. So I'll let you.
This would be Diggs and Winnie, or Winnie 1 and Winnie 2?
Diggs and Winnie.
Okay.
There's one for each.
Got it. Mr. Samuel, good morning.
I'm impressed. They're down to about, one of them is 10 seconds long, and one of them is 23 seconds long. I was surprised.
In an instant, intent can be formed, so it could be short. Who knows?
That's right. But I want my two partners here to review them, but at least at this point, I don't see a problem.
Okay. And how do you envision, assuming it passes Harvey and Palmer muster as well, are we agreeing on authenticity, and it would just be, here are some, what's the setting for the jury before you press play? Or maybe, if, I don't want to get the cart before the horse, why don't you guys confirm that it works out, and then that's probably the final discussion the two sides should have.
Sure, and I was hoping to do that maybe at our first break this morning. It's not going to be the first thing before the jury this morning, but we will get on the same page on the final version, and then maybe how we're presenting it to them as well.
I mean, I guess, talking out loud, I mean, you envision either of them testifying? More sure?
No.
I mean, Winnie or Dick?
No.
There's no reason for that.
Right. And given what Mr. Samuel said yesterday about really, you know, you could put a mannequin up there and play it.
We did have one on the gurney. You could
I
have.
did, you know.
Until Ms. Yalamaraju ripped its arm off.
There's a lawsuit pending. But, you know, my intent was, if you don't have an objection, I would tender it and then push play.
That sounds reasonable to me.
And
Okay.
There would be any comment, you know.
Just think through whether you want any setting provided. The defendant at one point gave a statement to, I would say nothing other than admitted and play. If you want it just floating out there in the ether,
I
these
think
disconnected
that's
statements.
Probably need to establish the date that
Just the
these
date.
interviews occur.
We're going to
Right.
stipulation going so that you have something to publish right before that we offer you.
Okay, I just, speaking from a juror's perspective, I want a little sense of when, not so much where, but just the context. Is he talking to him, it's a selfie? Or was he, who knows? So think through that.
The only other thing is, I don't think we've talked yet about the newspaper articles, which also have some of the same problems. We have newspaper reporters interviewing the police, and that's in the newspaper article. I'm not quite sure why that would come together. It's much more limited and easy to redact a piece of paper.
Sure, and I flagged the same concern, that there was,
Could you work with Carr to resolve?
No, absolutely. Of course.
You know, you guys repair the relationship, so.
We'll do it.
one step at a time.
Yep.
Video, it sounds like we're this close. Fingers close together. Okay. All right. Anything from the defense? That's okay.
Yes. Yesterday, I think we forgot to put on the record one of our sidebars.
Okay.
It was the one where I objected to the evidence coming in about the 401k policy. My
Okay.
objection was based on the same grounds as the objection to the life insurance policy. So-
Fair point. We did have a sidebar during which we talked about two aspects of the 401k. And this was, I believe, a byproduct of a juror question, or was it also a byproduct of a question from the state?
Right, it was testimony the state was eliciting
Okay.
from Angie Brooks.
Okay. And the concerns, I think, were twofold. One, the amount really doesn't matter, nor was paid, or am I misremembering what your concerns were?
No, those were both of my concerns.
Okay, and, okay, I think it came in the context of a question from a juror, but regardless, the concern was raised. And as I recall, it was framed along the lines of the life insurance classic example that was the subject of a motion in limine, that the state can't simply invoke the fact that there was life insurance on the victim to say, here's why the defendant did it. There has to be some nexus between the two. And the response from the state was, we're not necessarily getting into 401k evidence to show motive so much as to show the need for the money, the insistence of getting the payout in a pretty small window. And so it went more to the dire financial straits that the state is claiming Mr. Macgyver was in both before and immediately after Ms. Macgyver's death. Is that a fair representation of the state's perspective on it?
It is, right.
Okay, and Ms. Clark Palmer understandably was invoking the concern that this isn't proper motive evidence if there isn't some nexus, like Mr. Macgyver had Ms. Macgyver take out and fully fund the 401k 1 week before the incident. Certainly those aren't the facts. But I think in the context that the state was exploring it, and more importantly, the way in which the state will use it going forward, I was comfortable letting it in, but the objection was made and is preserved. Anything else?
Just a sort of a preview dealing with Dan Driskell, who's going to testify this morning, first thing. In his demonstrative exhibit, I have 2 objections. One is it references the life insurance policy.
Which one? Because I've heard of several. One that paid off the loan and doesn't seem particularly controversial, but maybe is in your mind. And then I learned there is another one.
Right. It references the policy where Mr. Macgyver is named as the beneficiary. The reason Mr. Driskell references it is because Mr. Macgyver listed it on a personal financial statement that he prepared in February 2017 after Ms. Macgyver died. So it comes up in the context of...
For what reason was he preparing a personal financial statement?
I don't know.
Okay.
But it was something that was prepared and provided to the state, I think, by previous counsel. Is that how y'all got
It was
it?
in the context of establishing his financial status regarding bond.
Okay.
Eligibility for bond.
All right, it was something you got from the defense.
Yes.
Okay.
So, I mean, I think we just ought to delete that reference and not talk about it. It's not relevant to the question of what was Mr. Macgyver's worth either before or at the time that Ms. Macgyver died.
I agree with that part. What's the dollar amount?
600. Well, so the dollar amount that shows up in the presentation, because it's what is reflected on the personal financial statement, is $400,000. In fact, the life insurance policy, when we calculated all of, is 600 and something.
Okay. But again, whatever number the state is using was handed to them by Mr. Macgyver's attorneys of record.
Yeah.
Okay. And it had a wrong number in it.
Yeah.
Okay.
But, okay, so that's one objection. Just let's delete any reference to the life insurance policy, understanding that when we get to our case, when we put up Mr. Culver, same agreement, he's not referencing the life insurance policy.
Mr. Macgyver isn't suddenly $600,000 wealthier.
Right. And I've talked with Mr. Rucker about that, and I'm sure he's going to explain his position, which I understand, but note that for the record. The second thing is that Mr. Driskell's demonstrative report kind of not only makes reference to, but sort of quotes some back and forth that was had between people at Arcilla Mining, which we haven't heard about yet.
Well, not in front of the jury. We've heard a little bit about a letter and authenticity of signature.
Which is not, I understand that that's not an issue anymore.
Yeah.
So I understand that experts can rely on documents and things that are not necessarily admissible themselves, but what I object to is the parts of his demonstrative that actually kind of quote from communications that are not admissible.
So for Mr. Driskell to say, one reason why I come up with figure X is I acquired information about an interest in Arcilla mining and I value it at $11. You're not objecting to that. It would be the equivalent of, because it's on an exhibit, Mr. Driskell reading from a document to the jury that he had obtained.
Right, like he, for example, he talks about an email from Mr. McKenzie, who's the CFO of Arcilla Mining. It's an email from Mr. McKenzie to Mr. McIver providing a value, related to Arcilla Mining. So, anyway, given that we haven't heard from Mr. Smith yet, or anything about Arcilla Mining, these demonstratives reference, another example is it references an email from Stephen Swenson, somebody, to Mr. McKenzie. So an email that doesn't even involve Tex McIver. And then it says in that email they reference a promissory note in a certain amount. That's kind of what my objection is, that
Okay.
we're
Well,
quoting things that aren't admissible.
the way you were proposing working through the insurance seemed at least fair. One side's not going to use it, the other side's not going to use it. The state is having to do both an affirmative showing and maybe some defensive work, knowing that Mr. Culver is waiting in the wings to share what he's going to share should the defense put on a case. What can you tell me about how Arcilla would play into Mr. Culver's presentation so that the state isn't told, oh, you can't talk about this, and then it's as if the state was hiding something from the jury because then Mr. Culver talks about Mr. Swenson and this and that.
Well, we're not going to talk about Mr. Swenson. I don't object to the state putting up and talking about Arcilla Mining and talking about, on certain dates, what was, in their view, Mr. McIver's, what's the numerical value associated with his interest? How did it change? Let's just not do these pages where it quotes from the email. Just put some numbers up.
Okay. All right. Those are the two concerns about the demonstrative that you understand will be used while Mr. Driskell testifies. Is that correct?
Yes.
This all relates to a demonstrative aid?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Mr. Rucker, if you're the right person, whoever's going to be working with Mr. Driskell, insurance and Arcilla hearsay.
I would ask the court to allow the presentation of the dollar amount with respect to the insurance. As with the 401k, the state has no intention of trying to make any claims whatsoever that the motive for the homicide is tied to Mr. McIver's desire to get Mr. McIver's insurance. That's not the purpose, but the purpose is we are in an area now where we are wrestling with the question of his financial status. And so, in months after her death, a detailed financial statement, personal financial statement form was submitted by the defendant, wherein he lists very specifically life insurance payable to Claude McIver, and he lists an amount. The fact that the amount is incorrect, that's not really, my issue. But I think it becomes relevant in that regard. And the financial statement was something that Mr. Driskell looked at in formulating his opinion, and I believe rightfully so. Secondarily, the defense also references the life insurance policy in its official summary report prepared by Mr. Jerry Culver. And so in the list of documents that he references that he considered is the life insurance policy. And specifically in his report, he says an analysis of life policies held by Mary Diane Macgyver revealed she owned 2 insurance policies, and he lists the policy, the date, and the amount of $480,000. And he goes on to say, on 1/31/05, the beneficiary was changed to Claude B. Macgyver III. And so, even in their experts' analysis and arriving at a conclusion with respect to the financial status of the defendant, they reference it. And so I do not, as I told Ms. Clark Palmer, I do not intend to elicit any testimony from Mr. Driskell about that specifically identifies the policy itself and says, well, hey, this is the reason why he killed his wife, or anything like that. It's one of several hundred numbers that we will probably go over today in the context of this testimony. And so I would ask the court to allow us to be able to present that evidence.
If it comes out of both sides' analyses, does it affect anything? Certainly affects. The numbers change a little bit, but if it comes out, does that suddenly mean, oops, we thought that the scales were like this, and now minus that number, it's a completely different landscape?
Well, it does change the landscape because it's a significant amount of money. And so I would say yes. I would say yes.
Okay. What about Arcilla?
Arcilla. I expect that there's going to be testimony from both sides about Arcilla. As part of Mr. Culver's conclusion, he gives a value, talks about the equity in Arcilla Mining and Land, and he gives a value for it, and he gives a date for it. And so we subpoenaed documents from Arcilla, and we are in the process of obtaining a certificate of authenticity from their CFO with respect to those documents. In an attempt to kind of cut witnesses, we had, Mr. Ted Smith here for a couple of days expecting to present him, primarily just to say, hey, I turned over documents to you guys, I drafted this letter, this was my opinion about it at the time, it may or may not have changed since then, and so I don't need him in order to obtain that information and put it before the jury. So I asked for a certificate of authenticity for the documents themselves.
Sure.
The documents were provided to Mr. Driskell. Based on that, he has certain opinions. I agree with Ms. Clark Palmer. There are a couple of emails that were contained in the documents that he referenced. And the quotes that are listed for those emails, I would submit to the court. He put them in my opinion, is put in as a reference point for him as he's discussing his conclusions. But it says, January 17, 2017, email from A. McKinsey Davenport, CFO, Arcilla Mining and Land, to Mr. Macgyver, providing a value of $6.3 million for Arcilla Mining and Land. That's all it says.
So it's a summary of what the email said, that there's a dollar figure.
Right.
Okay.
The other one, I believe that counsel brought to the court's attention, November 15th, 2016, email from Stephen Swinson, associate with James Bates, LLP, to A. McKinsey Davenport, CFO, Arcilla Mining, reference from email to a promissory note in the amount of $400,000 payable from T. Smith to Arcilla. So they're not really, not the email itself, not the actual words themselves, it's just a summary as to explain how he gets those numbers to be able to include in his opinion. And then the last email is let me make sure that I get them all. Did you talk about 30 email?
No, just 2.
Just 2, okay. And that's it.
Okay. So, Ms. Clark Palmer, just a little bit more on Arcilla. I think I understand now about the insurance. Your contention is that Mr. Driskell's written summary of what was in the email, because it doesn't sound like there are any quote marks anywhere.
I agree.
So what's the, if he were to say, I received information from Arcilla that values the company at $6 million, I don't know how the words are going to come out of his mouth. That seems like what an expert could talk about. And you, of course, would be free to cross-examine him on the substance of what it was he received, if that's what you wanted to do. But this is sort of in writing doing what he'd be saying, as opposed to putting quotations or an excerpt from emails that were not what Mr. Macgyver said, but were what other people said. If I'm misunderstanding the way... Okay.
That's it.
All right. Here's how I'm going to handle it. The state is approaching a line it needs not to cross, and that line would be to imply, insinuate, or directly argue at any point to the jury that insurance was a motive. And you cross that line, I expect a motion for mistrial, and we'll see what the consequences of that are. But the way you are telling me you propose to use insurance data is something I'll allow. But it needs to stay that way. It is a figure that's factored in making the calculations. And I don't have an issue with the way you've described what's in the demonstrative having come from Arcilla. Okay? Anything else, Ms. Clark-Palmer, as to Mr. Driskell?
No.
Okay, please, appreciate you flagging that now. I thought we were going to go through all our GBI witnesses, but we're going to do Mr. Driskell, which is state's prerogative.
And Mr. Colbert is in the courtroom?
I recognize Mr. Colbert. I think I've disclosed before, I've worked professionally with Mr. Colbert, brought in cases when I was at the U.S. Attorney's Office. I hold him in very high regard. I don't think that's going to affect anything I do, but I don't think that should concern the defense. But I flagged that with the state a while ago. So Mr. Colbert and I know each other, and he's welcome to be in court while the other expert testifies.
We have an agreement as that, and I just wanted to let you know.
Sure.
That's right.
All right?
I've heard someone really smart say that he's a very nice man. I told him that.
That's not true.
We'll see how his testimony goes. We may be reevaluating everything. All right, Mr. Rucker, you good to go?
Yes, sir.
Let's get the jurors in. Good morning, Deputy Murphy.
Good morning. Our jurors are present and accounted for, Judge.
Thank you, Deputy Murphy. You all can be seated. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning. Happy Wednesday. I had an early morning meeting today, so I brought my stuff down here. This is not my usual courtroom. And as I was heading out, I noticed that some of you get here early and have a breakfast together. That's a wonderful community you've developed. And I assume it helps you manage traffic to get here at that time. And I'm glad that Freshman's is open as early as it is. The Braves start their season tomorrow. I can't promise you that they'll win more than 50 games, but it's great if they do. What I can promise you is that if they make it to the World Series, we won't be together at that time. We got started a little late. You are coming in a little bit late because we worked through, the attorneys and I, a few matters concerning the state's next witness. But there were some things we had to discuss, so we got a slightly late start. No lunch meeting today, so we can be flexible as to when we stop for lunch, and we'll just move as efficiently as we can. Mr. Rucker, if you will call your next witness, please.
Yes, sir. Your Honor, the state will call Mr. Dean Driskell.
Raise your right hand. Do you swear and affirm that the testimony you should give the court today will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I will.
Yes, sir. If you will, have a seat. Get as close to the mic as you can during your testimony. For the purposes of the court's record, please state and spell your name.
Francis Dean Driskell III, FrancisDeandRiskell.
Mr. Driskell, you're going to be with us, I suspect, for a little while, so if you would make sure you're comfortable and as close to the microphone as possible, because we need to make sure folks in the far reaches of the courtroom can hear what you have to say.
Perfect, thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Could you turn and introduce yourself to the jurors by restating your name and tell them how you are employed?
Good morning. My name is Dean Driskell. I'm a managing director with FTI Consulting. I'm also an adjunct professor of accounting at Georgia State University here in Atlanta.
Okay. And can you tell the jurors what is FTI Consulting?
FTI is a boutique consulting firm. It's a publicly traded firm, has about 4,000 employees across all the business centers in the world.
Okay. And what kinds of work does FTI Consulting do?
They do a lot of different things. We have a corporate finance practice, we have a healthcare practice, we have a litigation and disputes practice. That's where I sit. And in that practice, we help, we work with clients, defendants and plaintiffs in litigations, and usually trying to assist with complex financial or accounting matters.
Okay. Can you share with the jurors a little bit about your educational background that allows you to do your work there at FTI?
I can. I have an undergraduate degree at Auburn University. It was a BS in Business Administration with a major in finance. I have an MBA from Georgia State University here in Atlanta. And then after my graduate degree, I took some additional accounting classes at Georgia State so I could sit for the CPA exam.
Okay. And can you tell the jury, first of all, let me let you know you're in Bulldog territory.
I do. I'm very well aware of that.
All right. And can you tell the jurors, are you a certified public accountant?
I am.
Okay. Now, can you tell the jury, how long have you worked at FTI?
A little over 14 and a half years.
Okay. And you were engaged by the state to perform some services with respect to this case?
I was.
Can you tell the jury when you were engaged and what were you asked to do?
I can't give you an exact date, but it was sometime October of last year. And what I was asked to do was assess Mr. Macgyver's financial position on or about the date of the death of his wife.
Okay. Now, can you tell the jury, are you the member of any professional organizations?
I am. I'm a member of the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants. I'm also a member of the Georgia Society of CPAs. I'm a member of the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners and also the Georgia chapter of the Certified Fraud Examiners. As Mr. Rucker said, I'm a certified public accountant. I'm also a certified fraud examiner, and I'm also certified in financial forensics by the AICPA.
Okay. Now, can you share with the jurors a little bit about your teaching experience?
I've been a teacher or an adjunct professor at Georgia State for about 10 years. I've taught a hodgepodge of different classes. I've taught undergraduate accounting classes, kind of the principles of accounting, if any of you have ever had those. Sorry. Where did I lose you? I'm sorry. Okay. I've taught undergraduate accounting classes, the principles of accounting classes, but mostly I teach in the graduate school. I've taught forensic accounting as a graduate school class, but mostly what I teach is a class which is the first MBA class that students take. It's called Financial Statement Analysis for MBAs, and it's kind of a hybrid class. It's part finance, part accounting, and it enables people who are not business undergrads to kind of get up to speed on the accounting matters, and then it gets heavy into accounting and finance. It's a tough class.
I don't do numbers, that's why I'm going. Can you tell the jury, do you have any previous expert testimony experience?
I do. I have issued reports and testified at deposition probably 10 to 12 times. Some of those have been in state court, some of them have been in federal court, some of them in bankruptcy court. I've only testified in trial one time.
And can you tell the jury, how does your education, training, and experience qualify you to offer opinions on what you were asked to do in this case?
Well, for the past 20 years or so, I've worked in the Big Four accounting firms and the boutique consulting firms doing the exact type of work that I'm doing in this case. I have hundreds of times I've analyzed financial statements, statements of net worth, balance sheets. Some of those engagements are reviewing those documents, and some of those engagements I'm producing them, but it's always assessing complex financial and accounting documents and matters.
And when you say the big four, what does that mean?
Well, the big four accounting firms are the national or international accounting firms. Ernst & Young. I did a stint I was actually at Arthur Andersen when Arthur Andersen went under, for those of you who remember back then. But they're the international accounting firms. And over time, it became very difficult for us to do the kind of work that I do in those accounting firms because of conflicts. And so, for the most part, people like me and to do the work that I do have spun off into the boutique consulting world. And I've been there for 14 plus years.
Okay. Now, were you given anything to review to assist you in formulating your opinions in this case?
I was.
Okay. And generally speaking, what were you given?
We received a lot of financial information. A lot of it were bank statements from Mr. Macgyver's accounts, tax returns, deeds, emails, correspondence. It was a significant file of paper.
Okay. And can you give the jury some idea about how many pages of documents did you review in this case?
It's difficult to give you an exact number because a lot of the information was provided to us electronically, so spreadsheets and things like that are not easily to determine how many pages they are. But my best guess is somewhere between 20 and 30,000 pages.
Okay. And as a result of the work you did in this case, were you able to reach certain opinions?
I was.
Okay. Now, this might seem like a silly question, but did you do this work for free?
No, I did not.
Okay. And can you share with the jurors, how do you bill for the work that you performed in this case?
We bill by the hour.
Okay. And did you have the assistance of anyone within your firm to help you with the work that you did in this case?
I did. I have a very talented and experienced team of people that helps me with projects like this.
Okay. Did they work on the case for free?
They did not.
Okay. Now, did your fees include the preparation of a report that contains your opinions?
It did.
Okay. And your fees include the preparation of a PowerPoint presentation to assist the jury during the trial?
Yes, it did.
What else do your fees include?
My testimony here today.
Okay. And in preparation for your testimony here today, can you explain to the jury what is a testimony binder?
Well, a testimony binder is something that I put together whenever there's a chance that I'm either going to be, my opinions are going to be examined in deposition or trial. And while it is not a comprehensive, obviously it's not a comprehensive set of documents that I've used to create my report and my opinions, it's some key documents and things. So if one of the lawyers asks me a question and I need to say, okay, where did that number come from? I can look in here and hopefully I can give him a good, concise, correct answer.
Okay. You have a copy with you here today?
I do.
Okay. And that's kind of what you can slide across the table in front of you?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, would it aid you in your presentation here today?
I think so, yes.
Okay. Now, let me ask you this. Were you also able to prepare a testimony binder so that myself and the defense attorney could also follow along with you?
I did. I gave you several copies. I think one for defense lawyers, one for you, and one for the judge.
Okay.
I like the sound of that.
I got it for you right here.
It's there.
And for purposes of the record, Your Honor, I will mark it at the appropriate time and tender it into evidence, tender it for the purposes of the record, not to go back with the jurors.
Okay.
Okay. Can you share with the jury what are the total amount of fees paid by the state for the work you've done in this case?
I think it's somewhere between $30,000 and $35,000.
Does that amount take into consideration that we're a governmental agency?
We certainly give governmental agencies a discount,
Okay.
yes.
All right. Fair to say that you can charge us for everything?
No.
Okay. At this time, Your Honor, I would tender Mr. Dean Driskell as an expert in the area of financial accounting and analysis.
No objection.
Okay, Mr. Driskell, for the purposes of this proceeding, you are qualified as an expert in the area of financial analysis and accounting. Did I quote that back right? I don't want to.
Yes, good.
That works?
What is your area of expertise to make sure we get it exactly right?
I think that's fine.
Great.
Now, can you tell the jury Did you prepare a PowerPoint to help with respect to your testimony and before the jury?
I did.
Okay. And the PowerPoint, is it contained on the jump drive?
It was. I believe it's now on this machine to my right.
Okay. And have you had the opportunity to review the PowerPoint to make sure that it accurately reflects the data that you examined and the opinions you will give this jury?
I have.
Okay.
Is there a reason why it needs to be on that screen rather than these screens?
Because this screen allows you to enlarge the really small numbers. You can make them bigger so that the jury can see them and not squint.
Okay.
But it will appear on each one of these screens. Ms. Convery is going to operate that part of the presentation.
Excellent.
Okay. Let me show you two documents. They are marked as State's Exhibits number 479 and also 484. Do you recognize and can you identify those exhibits?
I can.
And what is State's Exhibit number 479?
This is a printout of my PowerPoint presentation.
Okay. And that's a complete copy of the PowerPoint presentation that the jurors are about to see, should we be able to have it admitted.
It appears to be, yes.
Okay. And what is State's 484?
This appears to be a copy of my report, but it doesn't have the correct date.
Okay. What is the correct date?
I believe it was March the 8th.
Let me get that. There was an initial draft of your report.
Yes.
Correct?
Yes.
Is that what this is?
Yes.
Okay. And the conclusions for your initial draft, that you used for your initial draft report, did you receive some additional information?
I did.
And did it cause you to amend this initial report?
Yes, it did.
Okay. Judge, I would tender in the evidence State's Exhibit 479, which is the copy of the PowerPoint. I will mark the jump drive once we remove it from the board as State's 479A. But at this time, I would need to tender both of those exhibits into evidence.
479 and 479A.
Correct. A is the jump drive, and 79 is the paper version.
But not 484 yet.
Not 484 yet.
Okay. And 479 is demonstrative aid, so you're tendering it as a demonstrative aid.
That's correct.
And then 479A, I guess, would physically be made part of the record.
That's correct.
Okay, it's a digital version of 479.
That's correct, Judge.
Okay. Subject to the discussion we had outside the presence of the jury, Ms. Clark-Palmer, any objection to 479 coming in as a demonstrative aid?
No, no
Okay.
objection.
Your concerns are preserved. I will admit 479 and 479A.
Okay. And would the court permit Mr. Driskell to step down and we publish this demonstrative aid to the jury?
Sure, with the caveat that if it ends up being hard to hear him because he's over by the fancy screen, then we're going to need to restructure things.
Okay.
So they're going to wire you up.
Yep. You have a wireless mic.
Okay.
We're going to put on here, okay? Okay, so Mr. Driskell, be careful.
I don't want to trip over the wire and break this thing.
Come on, why don't you want to feel comfortable on this side or that side?
Maybe this side's better.
Okay. All right. So if we could start, if you could tell the jurors what we're looking at and the basis of why you put the PowerPoint together the way you did.
This is a copy of my PowerPoint presentation. I wanted to, instead of just sitting there and talking to you about numbers for an hour or more, this way you can kind of see some of the data up front.
Okay. Now, did you review, you told us you reviewed several documents. Did you contain within the PowerPoint and also your report, which we'll introduce in just a second, did you list out the documents that you reviewed to come to your opinion?
I certainly didn't list all of them, but I've given you a flavor here of what some of these documents look like. So it says documents reviewed and relied upon. This first section deals with bank statements, And within these bank statements, we had a lot of copies of deposits, copy of check images. There's six primary accounts for Mr. McIver. You'll see those listed here. There's 2 accounts that we had statements for Mrs. McIver and 1 for clay management.
Okay. What about the other documents?
The other documents, there's a couple more slides here that go through those, but there's everything. There's credit card statements, there are tax returns, warranty deeds, notes, personal financial statements that were prepared prepared for or by the defendant, listing of assets for the McIvers, various lease agreements, bank statement, other bank statements, 401k account statements, things like that.
Okay.
So it was a lot of documents.
Okay. As well as documents from Fish and Phillips.
Correct.
Okay. And can you share with the jury, you received documents with respect to a company called Arcilla. Could you briefly just explain that to the jurors?
I did. As part of a financial statement that Mr. McIver produced, he claimed that he had an interest in a 10% interest in a company called 2 companies called Arcilla Mining and Arcilla Trucking. Now he owns in his tax returns he has another entity called Arcilla Resources. So it's kind of hard to keep those 3 straight at some point, but hopefully I'll do a good job today of explaining to you how those interact in this matter.
Okay. Let's go on. Okay. Those are more documents?
More documents. Again, I didn't list every document that I've looked at, obviously, but there's some email correspondence here, some handwritten letters, and other miscellaneous correspondence.
Okay. And you've also got correspondence between Mr. and Mrs. McIver and a person by the name of Harold Hudson.
Correct.
Okay. Let's go on. So can you tell the jury, based on the analysis you did, what is the first opinion that you have with regards to Mr. McIver's financial status?
That Mr. McIver's cash position significantly worsened in the years leading up to his wife's death.
And can you tell the jurors what years did you focus on?
2013 and through 2016.
Okay. And can you tell the jury, throughout your presentation, this abbreviation here, this DOD, what does that stand for?
Date of death.
And so your first opinion is Mr. McIver's cash position significantly deteriorated from 2013 to Ms. McIver's date of death in 2016.
That's correct.
Okay. Can you explain to the jurors what you mean by that?
Well, in 2013, the reason I chose 2013 as a starting point is because that was the last full year that Mr. McIver was an equity partner at Fisher & Phillips. At that point in time, he had some, as I'll show in the schedules, he had some cushion in his cash. So if he was spending more money than he brought in, he had a little cushion to deal with that. By the time you get to 2016, that cushion was gone.
Can you share with the jurors what is your second opinion?
The second opinion is that Mr. McIver's net worth that he submitted in February of 2017 was overstated.
And can you tell the jurors what does that mean?
A net worth statement is like a snapshot or a report card of what your net worth is at any point in time. The problem with that net worth statement is that it includes some assets that were attributable to his wife. It also has some assets for life insurance policies that my understanding were claimed but had not been collected.
Okay.
And there's some other issues that we'll go through in detail when I can show you the detailed numbers.
Okay. What's your third opinion?
The third opinion is that Mr. McIver was experiencing financial stress leading up to his wife's death.
And can you explain that for the jurors?
I focused on 2 primary things. One is that at the period leading up to his wife's death, he understood that his tenure at Fisher & Phillips was going to end in the near future. What I'm going to show is that he had limited assets at that point in time in order to live off of whenever that income went away. The second is that I believe it's likely that his ability to deduct the losses from the ranch against his personal income would come to an end at some point, and I think he understood that.
All right, so let's go on.
So this is just a revision of opinion one, so starting
Now
with
we're
opinion
about
one.
to start the basis for your first opinion.
Yes, sir.
All right.
All right, so when I first got the financial information, the bank statements, the tax returns from the state, the first thing I did is I sat down and looked at the months in 2016 leading up to Mr. McIver's wife's death. And what I noticed relatively quickly is that more money was going out than was coming in. And so as a forensic accountant, I said, well, what's causing that? In some cases, it might be that you would be transferring money to savings accounts or investment accounts, things like that. That's not what I was seeing. It was mostly, it seemed like all the cash that was coming in was being spent on his normal living expenses in the ranch.
Okay. And can you tell the jury, in all of the analysis you did with respect to Mr. McIver's account, did you, financial accounts, did you find any savings accounts?
I did not.
Okay. So if you would take us through what we're looking at here on the screen.
Okay, so, and I realize that all of you are not accountants. One of the things that accountants do when they're looking at financial information is determine where cash comes from. So we call it a sources and uses analysis. So what I've done here, and again, I've done this for the years 2013 through 2016, and just to preface that, the way that his bank, remember there's 6 bank accounts that we're dealing with here, and they all have different periods, so they're not all on a monthly basis. They don't always start on January 1st, and they don't always end on January 31st. So I did this on a monthly basis, so the sum of this edges over a little bit into 2012. It's marked 2013, but just the way the bank statements line up, it moves a little bit into 2012. In 2016, I've stopped this analysis at September 26th of 2016, which is the date of Mrs. McIver's death. So I went through, I took all of his bank statements and started looking, so what money's coming in. So these are actual cash numbers that are coming into one of his 6 bank accounts. And I looked at them on a monthly basis, and then for you, so when we didn't have this giant spreadsheet up on the TV, I consolidated into annual numbers, except for this. This is a 9-month number.
Okay. And just so we can make sure we're clear, for instance, in 2013, what was the salary from Fisher & Phillips that Mr. McIver was able to receive? So
during that period, during 2013, $395,011 actually came into his bank accounts from Fisher & Phillips.
Okay. And in 2016, as of September 26, 2016, how much cash did Mr. McIver receive as salary from Fisher & Phillips that went into his bank account?
$134,048.
So the sources of cash that flowed into Mr. McIver's bank accounts, can you tell the jury where do the sources of that cash, where does it come from?
Sure. Now you can picture if you had 6 bank accounts, there's a lot of different transactions. There's hundreds and hundreds of transactions that are made up here. So what I attempted to do in order to simplify it is just create some large categories. Obviously, salary from Fisher & Phillips, that's one. He was collecting Social Security, so that was an obvious one to consolidate. He has tax refunds, and those would be tax refunds from federal and from state. So that's where money is coming to his account from those from the federal and the state treasuries. Redemption of investments, miscellaneous income, and these are 100 miscellaneous type transactions that didn't make sense to spread out into other categories. Then we have unreconciled income. Now this is when I saw deposits or transfers into his accounts that I could not identify. So I don't know where they came from. It could have been somebody gave him a check for cash and there was no copy of it, or it could have been a wire transfer and then I was not able to see what the other side of the transaction was. So that's unreconciled income.
But then you've got another category down here at the bottom.
I do. Those are transfers directly from his wife to his account, and that those were across all of 6 accounts.
Okay. And these are cash transfers into Mr. McIver's account from his wife.
Correct.
So in 2013, can you tell the jury what is the total amount of cash transfer from Mrs. McIver into Mr. McIver's account?
A little over $180,000.
And then as of September the 26th, 2016, how much cash from Mrs. McIver's account was actually transferred into Mr. McIver's account?
Almost $70,000. And you'll notice that that number is almost 25% of the total sources in the first 9 months of 2016.
So in 2016, the total amount of all the cash that went into Mr. McIver's account from all of these different sources totaled how much as of September the 26th, 2016?
$277,177.
It's the number of cash that went into his account.
Correct.
And the percentage of that cash that actually came from his wife, this $69,000, accounts for what percentage of that cash?
It's about 25%.
Okay, let's go on to the next one.
So what this slide does, is this takes the same data that I just showed you and it shows it to you graphically. Now, someone could critique this and say, well, you're saying that from 2013 to 2016, there's a 69% decrease in the sources of cash. And that would be a little fair because this only deals with 9 months. So what I did is I went back and looked and said, all right, well, if I took this entire year, what would it look like? And it would just go down, it would go down to 59%.
Okay.
But this does graphically show you the significant decrease of his sources of cash between the last year that Mr. McIver was an equity partner and 2016.
And this graph illustrates that the sources of cash from Mr. McIver from the last year he was an equity partner until the date of Mrs. McIver's death, it seems to decrease every single year.
That's correct.
Let's go on to the next one.
Now, we talked about the percentage of income or percentage of sources of funds that was from Fisher and Phillips. You'll notice that this number, and this number come directly from the same chart that I just showed you. So this is the actual cash that's going into his bank accounts. Now, the gross employment income, these are the numbers that Fisher and Phillips reported that he was making. So it would be the difference between what your company says you make, right, and the amount that's coming into your accounts. Sometimes that's a pretty big gap. But this is now an annual number. So I actually took all the money that he received into his accounts in 2016, not as of date of death, but as of December 31st. And the decrease between 2013 and 2016 is almost 55% on a net basis, 42% on a gross basis.
In 2013, the net amount, not the amount he was actually paid by Fisher and Phillips, but the net amount that actually went into his account was $395,011.
Yes, sir.
In 2013, the last year he was an equity partner.
Yes, sir.
Okay. And by the time we get over to 2016, and this number reflects all 12 months of 2016.
That's correct.
It doesn't stop at the date of death.
No.
So as of the end of 2016, $182,683 in cash actually went into his account.
That's correct.
And the difference between what he had in his account in cash as an equity partner his last year to 2016, when he was no longer an equity partner, reflects a 54% drop in the amount of cash that he received.
That's correct.
Salary pretty much cut in half.
More than half.
More than half. Okay.
So now we've talked about the sources of cash, so what's coming into his accounts. So now I'm going to show you for the same periods what went out of his accounts and what it was used for. And this is even, there are more varied transactions on money going out of anyone's accounts than they are coming in. So I've had to consolidate a few more categories, but this will give you an idea of where Mr. Macgyver was spending his money. And this is the same date issues, right? You've got date of death here, and you've got going in maybe a week or so into 2012 on this side. So the first category is payments to clay management and DSI. Now, this relates to interest payments that he's making to his wife on the $350,000 loan that she made him. And it's also reimbursement for payroll that she provides. So she pays some payroll for the ranch, he reimburses her. And so this is money going out of his account to reimburse her for those expenses.
Okay, and you know claim management to be an account that is wholly owned by Diane McGyver?
Yes.
As well as DSI?
I don't know for sure if that's 100% owned by Ms. McGyver or not. I know clay management is, yes.
Okay. Did you know that DSI stands for Diane Smith Interiors?
Yes.
Okay. And can you tell the jury, in 2013, what is the amount of cash Mr. Macgyver paid back to his wife for interest payments and other loans?
$46,122.
And by the time we get here to 2016, this is as of the date of death?
Correct.
Whenever we see that little asterisk, is that what that means?
Not always, but I've tried to at least warn you that there's a date thing that you need to be aware of. I don't want to try to trick anyone.
Okay. And as of 2016, date of death, what is the total amount of cash that Mr. Macgyver transferred into his wife's account?
$36,624.
And that roughly is a difference of about $10,000 or so?
Correct.
Over the course of those 3 years?
Correct. So you're better at math than you thought.
And this period, during this period though, you told us on the previous slide that Mr. Macgyver's income from Fisher and Phillips though was cut more than in half.
Correct. The amount of cash he was receiving cut more than half, yes.
But this expense back to his wife remained relatively, how would you categorize it?
It's pretty flat. Again, because this is only a 9-month number.
Can you share with the jury these other categories here, what do they reflect?
Sure. The second category, mortgage payments, these are the payments that he's making to the bank for the loan on the ranch. You've got assorted credit cards, you got office, insurance, taxes, vehicle expense. Farmers and Merchants Bank was an old credit line, so you see there were payments in 2013 and 2014, but not 15 and 16. You got repairs and utilities. You got checks to individuals, and that's just a hodgepodge. Some of them could be family members for birthday presents. Some of them may be payroll for people who work on the ranch. I'm not sure what all of them are, but they're assorted checks to individuals. You have miscellaneous expense, things that just don't neatly fall into any other category. You've got unreconciled expense. This is the same thing. I've got withdrawals from the accounts that I don't have any idea where they go. So there's just either there's not a check image or it's a wire transfer and there's no information that I can gather that would tell me where the money went. And then on the last category, just like on the category for sources of cash, are uses of cash that were payments to Mrs. Macgyver.
Let's go to the next slide.
So now that we've looked at sources and uses of cash, now we can net them and see what kind of a larger picture looks like. So what I've done here is I've taken the sources and uses for 2013 through 16, and again, this is as of date of death. And you can see in 2013, that number is sizably negative. So that means that there was more money going out than coming in. And it wasn't going to savings accounts. It wasn't going to investment accounts. It was spent on living in the ranch.
And so in 2013, the amount of money that came into Mr. Macgyver's account was how much?
$891,504.
But the amount of money that he spent in 2013 was how much?
$1,055,000.
And that reflects a difference of how much?
A negative $164,000.
And is this an example of more money going out than was coming in?
Correct.
So when we look at 2016, again, this is as of the date of death?
Correct.
How much money was coming in to the account as of the date of death?
$277,000.
$177?
$177.
Okay. As of the date of death, how much money was going out?
$342,552.
And that reflects a difference of how much?
A negative $65,375.
So as of the date of death, he had $65,375 more going out than came in.
During that 9-month period.
I should have asked and answered at the
Okay. I
I
think,
appreciate he's trying to emphasize a point. I like to do the same thing in my examination without getting cut off.
okay, 2 points. 3 points, one for you. I handle everyone the way they get handled, we don't need to have to, well, just me, them, that. Mr. Rucker, 2 things. I think we're okay with the thousands. We'll get through this faster if Mr. Driskell is able to say 277,000 instead of the remaining. Unless it's essential on a particular number.
I got it.
But I
I'm
think
just trying to be accurate, that's all. But I got you.
Secondly, I'm going to ask you to reduce, not eliminate, but reduce the times when you say, so the math you just told us is this math, and then you give it again.
Okay.
So we'll get through this faster. There may be certain things you want to emphasize, just like the defense may want to emphasize certain things, and that's okay. But let's save it for, usually it's in the lower right-hand corner. That one. All right.
Let's go on.
Oh, I forgot where we were. You have to remind me.
We're on the next slide.
Yeah, I think we made the point. We can go on to the next slide.
So again, graphically, I've showed the data that was on the previous slide here. So instead of sources and uses, I've tried to put them in layman's terms here and said earned and spent. So the green shows what he earned, the red shows what he spent. And if you add those up for the 3 years and 9 months, it's a negative $245,000. All right, so now, at the beginning, you asked me about the opinions about, what deterioration of cash means. So this slide shows you that, and again, I want to be really clear on the dates here. So at the very end of 2012 to the beginning of 2013, Mr. Macgyver and the consolidated 6 accounts had $165,000, almost $160, we'll use round numbers, $166,000 in his accounts. In 2014, this is at the end of the 2014 year, it dropped down to 88. 2015, it went up slightly to 102. 2016, at date of death, it's $24,567. That's a reduction from the beginning, late 2012 to early 2013 to the date of death of 85%.
And this is actual cash on hand.
Actual cash that's in his bank accounts.
And can you tell the jurors, what does this column reflect?
This is the net sources and uses that he received from his wife. So remember on the sources of cash schedule at the very bottom, I showed you all the money that had come from his wife, and then on the uses schedule at the very last line, I showed all of the monies that went out to his wife. This shows the net. So in 2013, he received $128,000 more from his wife than he gave her. $44,000 in 2014, slightly negative in 2015, and then almost $30,000 in 2016.
And can you explain to the jurors this box here at the bottom?
Yes.
What this means?
So as of Mrs. Macgyver's date of death on September 26th, Mr. Macgyver and his 6 accounts had cash on hand of roughly $25,000. If you reduce out the $30,000 that Mrs. Macgyver, the net $30,000 that Mrs. Macgyver provided him during 2016, he would have had a negative amount of a little over $5,000 in his all 6 checking accounts.
And so, without this roughly $30,000 in cash that was provided to Mr. Macgyver by his wife, based on what he had, he would have been a negative $5,000
Correct.
on the date of her death.
Correct.
And if I asked you if you could give the jurors like a word or two as an opinion regarding the availability of cash for Mr. Macgyver on the date of his wife's death, if we take his wife's cash out of the equation, how would you characterize it?
Well, it's a layman's term, but he was cash poor at her date of death.
Let's go on to the next slide. Could you explain that to the jurors?
These are the liquid assets that Mrs. Macgyver owned as of her date of death. She had 2 brand bank accounts, one with a balance of a little over $6,000, one with a balance of $269,000. So I've added those 2 up to get the $275,000 here in cash. So those are actual cash amounts. She had an insurance policy that totaled with the cash value a little over $600,000. And then she had a 401k valued at a little over $288,000. If you add all those up, it's rounded to $1.2 million. So now we get into opinion 2.
Okay. And can you tell the jurors what is your opinion for opinion 2?
That Mr. Macgyver's net worth was overstated.
Okay. Let's go into the next slide. And can you explain what we're looking at in this slide?
This represents the net worth statement that Mr. Macgyver presented either in late February 2017 or early March 2017.
Okay. And hold on 1 second. Ron, I'm going to tender an exhibit. It is labeled for identification purposes and states Exhibit 481. And being that there's no objection, I would just tender it as evidence.
481 is admitted.
Can you take a look at 481? Do you recognize it? Can you identify that?
Yes, this is the personal financial statement that I was referring to.
Okay, that is what we're looking at that appears on the screen for the jurors.
Yes, sir.
Okay. All right, go ahead with your presentation.
So again, a personal financial statement or net worth statement is again, it's a snapshot or a report card that shows how much you're worth at any point in time. It could change from day to day or month to month. But this is what Mr. Macgyver presented. And he takes his assets, he adds up the assets, and he says that they're worth about $4.4 million. Then he says he has liabilities of $719,000. Subtract the $719 from the $4.4 million, saying that he has a net worth of roughly $3.7 million.
Okay. Now, can you tell the jurors, this personal financial statement, it was provided by whom, or it was prepared for whom?
Mr. Macgyver.
Okay, and what is the date of this personal financial statement?
February 23rd of 17.
And that's approximately how many months after the date of death?
5 months?
And what were your, when you analyzed this personal financial statement, can you tell the jurors what did you find when you looked at the numbers?
Well, like I said, as I analyzed this, what my goal was initially was to take these numbers and say, what did these look like at Mrs. Macgyver's date of death? So the first thing I did is I looked at the checking accounts. And we know, based on the slides that we've already gone over, what his cash position was as of date of death. So I adjusted it from $60,000 down to $25,000. The second category is household furnishings and art, and schedules that were produced in the matter said that 100,000 of those were attributable to Mrs. McIver. So I deducted 100,000 from here, gave Mr. McIver the benefit of the other 100. Now I can't tell you for sure whether there's $100,000 worth of household furnishings and art, but I've assumed for the purposes of this analysis that it's correct.
And these numbers were all provided within Mr. McIver's personal financial statement?
These numbers, yes. The adjustments that I'm talking about here were provided by other attorneys for Mr. McIver.
Okay, continue.
Okay, jewelry, $150,000. The schedules that I saw said all of that $150,000 of jewelry belonged to Mrs. McIver. So I deducted out the $150,000 here. The next category is life insurance payable to Mr. McIver. Now, my understanding is that a claim was made against this life insurance policy and that as we sit here today that it's not been collected. But even so, as of the date of death, that would not be an asset because an event would have to happen, in this case Mrs. McIver's death, in order for that to be collected. So I've deducted that $400,000 out. Now the next two categories here are notes receivable and other assets. Now, I don't know what makes up that $300,000. There's a possibility that it relates somehow to these Arcilla entities that we're going to talk about shortly. But neither here nor there, I don't know what makes up those numbers. I don't know whether that $300,000 is real numbers or not. But again, for purposes of this analysis, I've left it alone. The next category, and this makes up two things. It makes up the Buckhead condo and it makes up the ranch. Now, I don't know, I've not seen an appraisal or anything for the value of the ranch, so I personally do not know what the value of the ranch is, but there was a produced document, an appraisal for the condo showing that the condo was worth $650,000. So what I did is I attributed $650,000 to the condo out of this $2 million, and then I put the remainder as real estate related to the ranch. So $1.3 million, $1.35 million.
Okay.
So then I said, all right, well, first of all, Mr. McIver doesn't own the condo. Mrs. McIver owned the condo. So I deducted the $650 out, so that $650 would be zero. And for the ranch, Mrs. McIver owned half the ranch. So you'd have to subtract half of the $1.3 million here and give him a remainder of $675. Now, the important thing to note here is that of this $675,000, Mr. McIver has very little equity in the ranch because of two things. Here's the liability for the bank, the $309,000, and the $350 that he owns to his wife for the ranch. So if you take the $309 and you add the $350, you get $659 of the $675. So he has very little equity in the ranch. Okay, the next category is recreational equipment. I don't know what that is, but I've left it alone. Retirement plans. There's a lot wrong with the documentation related to the retirement plans. There's several retirement plans at play here. The balances change over time, and we don't have a complete record. But for now, and I'll talk about this more later, I've left this $1.2 million alone and assumed it's correct. Stocks, I don't have any evidence of stocks outside of retirement plans. They may exist, but I don't have any reliable way to say that that's correct or not correct. And then vehicles, I've left this alone because of the $75,000, $60,000 is debt. So he really only has equity, if this is right, he only has equity of $15,000 in vehicles. So after all these adjustments, I deduct about $2 million out of this $3.7 million to get to $1.7 million of net worth. And of that 1.7, a majority of it is the $1.2 million in retirement plans, which at some point will have to be taxable, right? And these $300,000 worth of notes receivable and other assets. That's a majority of what's left. Now, one thing that I meant to say at the beginning of this slide is that in addition to this $3.7 million, there was a letter attached to this. And what the letter was from a business partner of Mr. Macgyver's that stated that Mr. Macgyver's interest, his 10% interest in those two entities that we talked about earlier, Arcilla Mining and Arcilla Trucking, were worth somewhere between $1.5 and $2.5 million. Now, I don't know how that $1.5 to $2.5 million is allocated here, whether it's allocated here, but the certainty here is that as of the date of this financial statement, Mr. Macgyver did not own 10% of those entities. They were sold before the date of this financial statement.
And you received documents to show you that?
Correct. And we'll go through that more in a few slides, but I just wanted to explain that I, as I sit here, don't understand how that 1.5 to 2.5 million is accounted in here, if at all.
Okay. And this number here reflects what? 3.7 million?
That's what Mr. Macgyver claimed his net worth was as of February 23rd.
Okay. And this $1.7 million number here reflects what?
That's the number that I've created to assess what his net worth was as of his wife's date of death. So it's not quite apples to apples. But now, I apologize in advance that this is really small, and so I'm going to make it bigger in a minute so that you can see dollars exactly from the previous slide. And what I've done is I've added column headings here or rows here that will be attributable to Mrs. Macgyver's personal assets and then her business assets for clay management to show you what Mr. Macgyver's net worth looked like on September 25th or the hour before Mrs. Macgyver's date of death versus what it would look like as he was the executor of the estate the day after her death.
Okay.
So what I've done here is I've added back the insurance policy here because, right, as of after her date of death, that would be an asset. I've added back I've added back the condo. I've added back her interest in the ranch, and then I've added her other assets and the assets of clay management that were provided by the Macgyver's lawyers. Now, there's a range for some of those assets. These valuations were done, I think, in March-ish of 2017, maybe. And so, obviously, they didn't know an exact value for some of these things, so they gave a range. And so I've used that range here to show you what the difference is in the net worth. So if I try to make this bigger so that you can see what these assets are, you've got...
Could you just explain to the jury?
Sure. You've got the condo. You've got her half interest in the ranch. You've got furniture and fixtures. You've got $275,000 in brand bank accounts that we talked about several slides ago. We've got jewelry, wedding rings, wine collection, and her 401k amount.
Okay. And some of Ms. Macgyver's assets, can you tell the jury what was the source for these numbers that reflect Mrs. Macgyver's assets?
They were produced by lawyers for the Macgyvers.
Okay. Regarding her estate?
Yes.
Okay. And these clay management assets, can you explain those to the jury?
There's a building that Clay Management owned, and again, Mrs. Macgyver was 100% owner of Clay Management. There was a condo.
It was separate and apart from the Atlanta condo?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
There's a car, a Hyundai Accent. There's some ground leases. Now, these ground leases, my understanding of the way those work is that they're annual payments that are made to her, but I had no ability to find out how long those payments would be made, so I tried to be very conservative and just assume that it was for 1 year, and so I've given her credit for only 1 year. It could be in perpetuity. I just don't know. I don't have copies of the ground leases, so I can't analyze them. You've got billboards, and then you've got loan receivables. So you notice that you've got a loan receivable to James Hugh, you've got a loan receivable from Ann Schwall, from Phyllis Gable, and then obviously this is the $350,000 loan to her husband.
Okay. And so can you tell the jury, Mr. McIver's, this number here reflects what?
That's Mr. McIver's total assets as he listed them as in February of 2017.
2.4 million.
Yes.
And this was before the death of Mrs. McIver. Is that what this number reflects?
Well, it includes assets that he got after her death.
Okay.
Yes.
So this number includes his assets and the assets he would have received from Mrs. McIver?
Some of her assets,
Some of
yes.
them. Okay. And so this middle column reflects what?
This basically shows that the day after her death, what assets he would have received for her personal and business assets.
Okay. And so what is the number associated with the personal and business assets Mr. McIver would have received as of the date of Mrs. McIver's death?
I'm going to show you on the next slide because it's easier. This is it totals up to $3.6 million. Those are the assets that he would have received from Mrs. McIver's personal and business. That's on the low side. And then on the high side, it's $4.6 million.
And what accounts for the difference?
The estimates that the lawyers made for the value of some of the assets.
Okay.
So,
And so, as you told, oh, sorry, go ahead.
So this number here, so the day before death, $1.7 million, Mr. McIver's net worth. The day after death, 5.9 or 6 million to 6.9 million.
Mr. McIver's net worth changed over the course of a couple of hours. How much? An estimate.
Is that $4 million?
Can you tell the jury what we're looking at here?
So again, this shows Mr. McIver's net worth the day before. This shows Mrs. McIver's assets low and high. So it's basically just a summary of what was in the previous slide.
Can you tell the jurors what this slide reflects?
This is a timeline that I put together that shows the Arcilla transaction.
Okay. And can you take the jurors through it?
I can. So I know we've talked about a lot. So as of the date that financial statement was provided, there was a letter attached from one of Mr. McIver's longtime business partners that said that this 10% interest that he owned in Arcilla Mining and Trucking was worth somewhere between $1.5 and $2.5 million.
I'm sorry.
It was valued at between $1.5 and $2.5 million. So that letter was dated December 5th, 2016. What that letter also said, and I've used quotes here, says this evaluation is to be considered strictly confidential and is not to be used as an appraisal, submitted as evidence, or as an official document. So there's really nothing in the letter that shows what the basis of this calculation is. It just says that this 10% interest is worth between $1.5 and $2.5 million. So again, that's December. So we have date of death at September 26, 2016. A little over 2 weeks after that, there are emails that are going back and forth between the CFO of Arcilla Mining and Land and an associate with James Bate, Brannon, and Groover. And I'm not sure if that's a law firm or whether it's a real estate firm, but they're talking about how they provide language in this agreement for Mr. McIver to purchase the 10%, his 10% ownership in these companies. And what the emails say basically is that that Arcilla Mining and Land is planning on giving Mr. MacGyver a promissory note of $400,000. But what we found when we looked at, as we analyzed this transaction a little more, is that Mr. MacGyver had already made capital withdrawals of his interest in this 10% interest of $75,000 in April of 2012, of $30,000 in August of 2016, and $20,000 in October of 2016. So he really didn't have a 10% interest at that point in time as he started withdrawing his capital. So he basically was getting advances on that interest that he owned. So at this point in time, as of November of 16, if you add those together, you add the promissory note and with the withdrawals he already made, the value of that interest, let's say it's might be $525,000. So that's as of November of 2016. We've already talked about December 5th of 16. That's when the CEO of Arcilla Trucking and Mining issued this letter of what the value was. So let's fast forward to January of 2017. In January of 2017, there's actually a purchase agreement for Mr. MacGyver's 10% interest. Now the problem is I'm going to show you in a second, is there's some other correspondence later on in the month that shows that obviously the deal wasn't quite done yet, but this purchase agreement is signed by all the parties, and the purchase agreement is dated January the 1st. There are no separate dates on the signature lines.
So tell the jurors, what do you mean by a purchase agreement?
Well, the purchase agreement was between Arcilla Arcilla Mining and Trucking, which was the company itself, and Mr. MacGyver, who owned 10% of that company. So basically the company was buying back the last 10%, the only 10% they didn't own that was owned by Mr. MacGyver.
Okay. And can you tell the jury, in this purchase agreement, were the terms set out?
Yes.
Can you tell the jury what were the terms set out for Arcilla Mining to buy back Mr. MacGyver's 10% interest?
The purchase agreement was for $700,000. That was for the total 10% interest. But again, Mr. MacGyver had already made withdrawals of his interest, so you would have had to deduct those things that we'd already talked about to get to a number that he would still be due of about $575,000. So as of sometime in January of 17, because here there's another email that goes back and forth between Mr. MacGyver and the principals of Mining and Land. It says that they believe the value of the entire company is $6.3 million. So if the value is $6.3 million, 10% of that would be $630,000. Nothing near 1.5 to 2.5 million. So the deal's not quite done, at least in January 17, although the agreement is dated January the 1st.
Let me show you an exhibit. It is marked as State's Exhibit 148.
That's what you get, Counsel?
The certification?
No, I'm sorry. Hold on one second, Mr. Driskell.
Okay.
Let me show it to counsel. Okay. Your Honor, I will tender State's Exhibit number 148 to evidence.
Okay, admitted. Ms. Yell and Roger, we be getting in my list on 148 is fine, but we've been in the 480s now, and my list doesn't go past 460.
I'll get you one.
Great. Thank you. But in the meantime, 148 is admitted.
Okay. And can you tell the jurors what is State's Exhibit 148?
This is the letter that I was referring to. This is the letter from Ted Smith, the president and CEO of Arcilla Mining and Land, and it's written December 5th of 2016, addressed to whom it may concern.
Okay. And could you read the letter for the jurors? We can't put it up on the screen because we've got everybody else tuned in to the PowerPoint.
Sure.
It's not a long letter, is it?
No.
And just read slow.
To whom it may concern, re Claude Tex McIver's company interest in Payable and Holdings. As president and CEO of Arcilla Mining and Land Company, LLC, and Arcilla Trucking Company, LLC, I have been asked to render a professional opinion as to the current values of Claude Tex McIver's interests. My qualifications for this rendering include formal education and over 60 years of family history in geology and mining. Arcilla mines and transports millions of tons of kaolin annually and regularly assesses the value of reserves and property. My evaluation of Mr. Macgyver's privately held current holdings includes an EBITDA-based calculation for his minority shares and estimated mineral worth by inferred drilling on the 3 tracts that Mr. Macgyver has an interest in. The estimation of all current holdings lays somewhere between 1.5 million and 2.5 million. This value could be impacted based on changes in market conditions. This evaluation is to be considered strictly confidential and is not to be used as an appraisal, submitted as evidence, or as an official document submitted by Ted S. Smith, President, CEO.
Okay. And based on the analysis that you did with respect to Arcilla and Mining Company, is this valuation given for Mr. Macgyver's interest, is it consistent with what you saw?
No.
And how is it inconsistent?
Well, I can't sit here today and tell you what the value of this 10% interest is, but it's clear from the negotiations that are going on here that it's worth somewhere between $500,000 and $700,000. And it was sold by the time Mr. Macgyver's financial statement was issued.
In February of 2017.
Correct.
Okay.
So as of February 17, all Mr. Macgyver was due was 5 payments of $73,000, according to this, according to the purchase agreement. So 73,000 times 5 is $365,000, and that number would have to be discounted by some amount to account for the fact that Arcilla Trucking and Arcilla Mining may determine at some point in the future that they're just not going to pay it. So there has to be some discount attributable to that. So the $365,000 paid over 5 years is not equal to $365,000. It's equal to something less than that.
Okay. Can you share with the jury, what is opinion 3?
Opinion 3 is that Mr. Macgyver was experiencing financial stress leading up to the death of his wife.
Okay. And Judge, this will be a natural stop point. I know we haven't had our morning break.
We haven't been going all that long just because we started a little bit late, but let me consult with the folks whose opinion matters. You all ready for a break, or would you like to learn about opinion 3 first? Keep going, I'm seeing that gesture. Okay, let's keep going. You know how to signal if you need a break. Okay, but let me, one more important person to check with. You okay? Okay, she's going to take a quick restroom break. If anyone needs, I don't want this to deteriorate into a 20-minute break. If you need a quick break, stand up and take advantage of it, but the rest of us will sit tight.
I apologize. I have just a couple of questions. If we could go back to that previous slide with Arcilla.
This one?
Yes. Let me ask you a question.
Sure.
Could you tell the jurors this? In your opinion, if there was a $2.5 million interest for Mr. Macgyver in Arcilla, can you think of any reason why he could not attain the cash value of that interest and then use it to pay off the $350,000 loan?
I don't know how readily there would be a buyer, but I mean,
Say it again.
I don't know how readily there would be a buyer for that 10% interest, but I mean.
But assuming he could cash it in.
I don't see any reason that he could not.
Okay. And want to make sure we're clear. The financial statement that we've admitted into evidence as State's Exhibit 481, that is the personal financial statement that was prepared for Claude Macgyver on February the 23rd of 2017. This $1.5 to $2.5 million interest is not listed in this personal financial statement, is it?
Not that I can tell.
Now I think we can go on to opinion 3. Okay, could you explain to the jurors your third opinion?
The third opinion is that Mr. Macgyver was experiencing stress up until the death of his wife.
Okay, And what is the basis for that opinion?
There are two primary things going on. The first, Mr. McIver knew that his employment with Fisher & Phillips was coming to an end. And as we talked about in his, we showed his financials, the only large asset that he had any equity in was his retirement accounts. There's email correspondence going back and forth between he and his wife in mid-2016 saying that, hey, you know, my primary concern is debt. You know, there's frequent instances in 2015 and 2016 where he's overdrafting his accounts. And at the point where he loses his income with Fisher & Phillips, the question is how is he going to maintain this lifestyle? How is he going to maintain the ranch? The ranch costs between somewhere around $17,000 a month based on my analysis to run. That's about $200,000 a year after tax. So he needs to earn something north of $280,000 just to cover the ranch expenses. So the question is when he loses that income and he has to rely on his Social Security and his retirement accounts based on that spending history, how long is that going to last? What I'm going to do is I'm going to show you that based on an analysis that I did, that it's not going to last very long.
Okay. And based on your analysis of a $17,000 per month expense to the ranch, that total roughly adds up to how much a year?
About $200,000 a year on average over the last 4 or 5 years for the ranch.
And do you recall what was the cash into Mr. McIver's account in 2016 as of September? Do you recall that number?
I don't recall off the top of my head. I can go back and look at the slide.
See if it refreshes your recollection. Page 10 of your PowerPoint.
So in 9 months of 2016, he had $277,000 come into his accounts.
Okay. Now, you said to the jurors that you also looked at some emails between Mr. McIver and Mrs. McIver, and you said that something about my primary concern is debt.
Yes.
Okay. Can you tell the jurors who says that?
Mr. McIver says that to Mrs. McIver in the email.
Sure. We're trying to just work through an issue, Judge. Save us some time. But this is State's Exhibit 14738 for identification purposes. And as I understand, there is no objection to...
No objection to the entire document, so.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
147-38, so it's from that binder 147.
That's correct.
Number 38.
Yes, sir.
Got it, I follow. And there's no objection, so it's in.
Okay. And so, is this an email chain between Mr. McIver and his wife, Mrs. McIver?
Yes.
Okay. And do you see the email wherein you reference Mr. McIver's conversation with his wife about debt?
Yes.
Could you read exactly, word for word, what it is that Mr. McIver says to his wife after you tell the jurors the date of the email?
This email was dated June 15th of 2016. It's from Tex McIver to Diane McIver at 3:22 p.m. It says, I am seriously trying to reduce my monthly expenses. Debt is my biggest obstacle right now. Plan on hitting the lotto sometime this week.
Okay. And can you tell the jurors, is there a response back from Mrs. McIver?
There is.
And can you tell the jurors the date and the time?
It's dated the same day, June 15th, 2016 at 3:50 p.m., so roughly 30 minutes later, from Diane McIver to Tex McIver. And it reads, make sure you read Javier's job description. That is your next life chapter. save you lots of moolah. You will be standing there with your hand out when I get in the door every Friday.
Do you know who Javier is?
My understanding is he works at the ranch.
And can you tell the jurors, is there a response back to that email from Mr. McIver to his wife?
There is.
Date and time, and then if you would share with the jurors what he says back.
It's dated June 15th, 2016, so same day at 4:16 p.m., so roughly 26 minutes after the previous email. And it reads, this is from Tex McIver to Diane MacGyver, and it says, oh well, comma, back to gigoloing.
And those emails were roughly about how many months from our date of death?
3 months.
Okay. Can we go on and show the jurors the basis for opinion 3?
Sure. So, as we discussed, Mr. MacGyver, around the date of death, had money in retirement accounts, and that was his primary assets. There's a letter in the file from one of his financial advisors that says that this $1.3 million is the value of his retirement accounts as of sometime in December of 2016. So I've used that for this analysis because of the problems I told you I had with the account statements for his retirement accounts. So what I did here is I calculated what I believe to be his marginal tax rate for federal. I don't have any tax returns for state, so I just used 6% for Georgia, which is kind of standard for Georgia, to come up with what his average tax rate was, or would be. I looked at his investments and I said, well, any money that we have in our retirement accounts, you're going to have to pay taxes on it eventually as you withdraw it. So that whatever you withdraw is going to be some number less than's there. So I affected this number by his tax rate to come up with a total payout of about $840,000. And then I looked at his average monthly expenses for 2015 and 2016 and used those as a proxy for what he might continue to spend. And again, a lot of this is on the ranch. So he spends about, during this period of time, he spends about $35,000 a month. That equates to about $422,000 a year. And at that rate, that $839,000 will only last 24 months. So while that $1.2 or $1.3 million seems like a lot of money, and it is, at this rate of spending, it'll last 2 years.
Can we go on to the next slide?
Sure. So the next issue, as I mentioned, deals with specifically with the ranch. There are emails that go back, that I've seen, that go back as early as 2009, where Mr. MacGyver and his accountants and lawyers are talking about the expenses of the ranch and that they're deductible, and that he uses the losses on the ranch to offset his income, his substantial income at Fisher & Phillips. Now, I don't know how many of you have ever had a side business like that where you use losses, but in real simple terms, if you have a job where you have a salary, say you work at a law firm or an accounting firm like I do, you get a salary. If you have a side business, and that side business could be anything. It could be a babysitting business, it could be a computer programming business, a dog walking business, or for what Mr. MacGyver has, it's a ranch. And
Could it also be like a tax planning business? Or
anything, tax planning, tax preparation business, any side business that you have. And what the IRS says is that you can, if you lose money on that business, you can use those losses to offset your other income, so the salary that you make. But they'll only let you do it for a little bit of time. If you continue to lose money at this business for year after year, what they say is that's not really a business, it's a hobby, right? So the IRS says no, their rule of thumb is that you need to make a profit 3 out of every 5 years. And if you don't do that, they're not going to allow you to take those losses and offset against your normal job income. So I looked at Mr. McIver's tax returns for 2011, 2012, 2014, and 15. As far as I know, I don't have a 2016 tax return. And 2013 was missing a lot of the schedules, and so I couldn't really do much analysis on 2013. But what I've done is I've looked at 11, 12, 14, and 15. And this top line, this shows the income that this farm or ranch generates on an annual basis. $53,000 in 2011, $4,200 in 2012, and I'm going to go back and talk more about this in a minute. That's the reason there's a star there. $23,000 in 2014, and $12,000 in 2015. You see it doesn't generate a lot of income, but it does have a lot of expenses. These are the expenses that are attributable, and these come straight from Mr. McIver's tax returns. It's $265,000 in 2011, $169,000, $183,000, $195,000. These average. So for this 4-year period, on average, the ranch generates about $23,000 in income, but about $200,000 in expenses. And that's where that $200,000 number came from that I mentioned earlier, or about $17,000 a month. So these are the losses that he had for these years, except for 2012. 2012, his tax return showed a pretty substantial profit, which was different than these other years. And so I went and looked a little closer, and there's a one-time payment, $250,000 for consulting fees that was recorded as part of this ranch income in 2012. And I said, that looks unusual. And I asked the state if they could look into that and find out what that if they could ask. We had a copy of the check. We knew where it came from. It said consulting. Said that seemed odd for a farm or a ranch. So I said, could you look into this? And that they received a letter that basically stated that the $250,000 didn't have anything to do with the ranch. It had to do with legal consulting work that Mr. McIver did. So I've subtracted that $250,000 out of this farming income. If you look at they all have substantial losses. So while I can't sit here today and tell you when the IRS is going to say this isn't a real business, it's a hobby, it's more likely than not that it's going to happen at some point. Now the question is how does that impact Mr. McIver's financial position when that happens? Well, I went through a very painstaking process of recalculating 4 years of Mr. McIver's tax returns to show what the impact would have been. In 2011, and this is only federal because I don't have state returns. In 2011, Mr. McIver had a calculated tax that he owed the IRS of $68,837,000. Without the benefit of these losses to offset his Fisher and Phillips income, his tax bill would have been $136,796. So the expenses that he had on the ranch saved him almost $68,000 in taxes. And that's actual checks that he would have had to write to the Federal Reserve for his tax bill. If you look at all 4 of those years, that averages out to about $55,000 a year that he's saving in taxes. Real money, dollar for dollar. So if the IRS comes and says, look, this ranch is a hobby, that's on average the additional tax bill that he's going to get.
So in addition to what you've already shared with the jurors is the amount of money that Mr. McIver has going out. That $55,000 gets put on top of that.
That's correct.
And in your opinion, given his financial picture in 2016, does that make his position financially better or worse?
Worse.
Okay. Is that the conclusion of the PowerPoint?
It is.
Okay. Okay. Just got 1 second. Slide back. Is show you a newly marked State's Exhibit 484. Madam Court Reporter requests that you put the microphone back on. She says you sound better with it on.
Anything, please. Better?
Let me show you State's Exhibit 484. Do you recognize and can you identify that?
Yes, I do. This is my report dated March 8th of 2018.
Okay. That's the latest amended report that you submitted to the state
Yes, sir.
regarding your analysis in this case.
Yes, sir.
Okay. I will tender State's 484, Judge, into the record.
It is admitted into the record, assuming there's no objection to it being admitted into the record.
Correct.
Okay.
And Judge, at this time, I would like to tender into evidence a series of documents that were used in the analysis for Mr. Driskell. And if I could just create a record, I've got a list. And I propose to just list them all out and then tender them all at the end. These are all business certifications.
You have a manila folder full of documents that represent the universe of materials Mr. Driskell relied upon to reach the conclusions and findings that he just shared with the jury.
Yes.
Okay. Is there any objection to that folder being collectively admitted as, we'll give it a number in a minute, into the record? Ms. Clark-Hall?
No.
Were you planning on publishing any of, you just want that corpus of information in the record effectively to accompany 484?
That's correct.
So I'm not going to, you pick your own number for it, but maybe we could get a red well to put it all in so they're not individually numbered, and they would be the appendix to 484.
That works for me. The printed out version of all these documents takes up about 40 boxes. And so I would not submit the paper documents. All the documents are contained on disk.
Got it. Okay.
But just to be clear, these are bank records, which I, primarily, which I don't have an objection to. It's not everything you looked at.
Okay, and I'll let you,
It's
sure.
fine.
And I was trying to be careful on that. I worded it is a part of the universe of what, and you'd like to make that part of the record.
A major, major, major part of the universe, yes.
Okay. What are you numbering it as?
The last individually number I have for any exhibit in this folder is 478. So I will take the judge's suggestion and I will number this as 484B.
Okay.
As much as A is the jump drive for the PowerPoint.
Got it. So 484B is the collection, it is a collection of supporting materials along with the business certifications, et cetera, that Mr. Driskell relied upon. Any objection, Ms. Clark-Palmer, to making that collection of materials part of the record as 484B?
No.
Okay. Admitted?
And I would like the record to reflect that each one of those business certifications, as well as the information attached to the certification, was shown to defense counsel prior to Mr. Driskell's testimony.
Okay.
I also would like at this time to tender State's 483. It is a business record certification for records obtained from Arcilla Mining and Land. It includes articles of organization, the certification itself, purchase agreement, transfer of interest, and all other related documents. It's 483.
Okay, and are these things you want to have made part of the record, or you're going to be working through them more so than we've already heard about?
I don't expect to.
Okay, any issue with making them part of the record?
No.
Okay, they're admitted. Bless you.
Bless you.
One of the things you said is that amongst the amongst the things that you looked at with respect to the defendant's financial status is you sorted out checks that you said were made to like personal friends or individuals for various amounts. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Let me show you an exhibit. It is 297. Okay. Let me show you an exhibit. It is states 297. And can you tell the jury what is 297?
It's a copy of 2 checks.
Okay. And can you tell by looking at it, I know it's a real, not a great copy, but the bank for which the checks are drawn on is what bank?
Brand Bank.
And did you analyze bank records from Brand Bank?
I did.
And can you tell the jury, in addition to your calculation with respect to the defendant's financial status, did you also look at Ms. Macgyver's financial status?
I looked at some things related to Mrs. Macgyver. I didn't have nearly the volume of documents that relate to her as I did to Mr. Macgyver.
Okay. And can you tell the jury, did you make any analysis with respect to Mrs. Macgyver's spending habits?
I did not.
You did not, okay. So if you look at the check that is contained on the top portion of that exhibit,
Yes, sir.
can you make out who that check is made out to?
It's made out to Tex McIver
And the check comes from what account?
from a Brand Bank account owned by Mrs. McIver.
And I'll tender 297, that top portion only.
Okay, no objection.
Okay, so what's listed here is, on the exhibit list is 2 checks, we're only talking about the top piece.
Correct.
Okay.
And
It's
I will, yeah, and I will redact the exhibit, Judge,
Okay.
before it goes back. And can you tell the jury, what is the date of that check to Mr. Macgyver from Mrs. Macgyver?
September 8th, 2016.
And can you tell the jury, what is the amount of the check?
$20,000.
I want to show you 2 other exhibits. These are state's exhibits number 486 and 487, Judge. Mr. Driskell, can you recognize and identify them?
I do.
And what are they?
The first is a letter from the law firm of Charles A. Gower to Mr. Abate. And the second is a check from Charles A. Gower, attorney at law, to an entity titled AA LLC.
Okay. And in your discussion with the jury regarding the farm being used as a way to offset Mr. McIver's fish and Phillips income, did you reference a check that you saw that got attributed to the farm income for $250,000?
I did.
And did you also talk to the jury about how you asked the state to obtain information about it?
I did.
And is that letter what you referenced to the jury with respect to the information that was obtained about that check?
Yes, it is.
At this time, I would tender to, 486 and 487.
No objection to the check. I object to the letter coming in.
Okay, and as I understand it, it's a letter written by an attorney, not Mr. McIver, to Mr. Abate, another attorney, not Mr. McIver. They will explain some things that we've been hearing about.
That's correct, Judge.
Okay. Do you have a theory of admissibility for 486?
No, I understand the objection. Okay, here's the check.
487 is admitted with no objection. 486 for now is not admitted.
Okay. Can you tell the jury the check, AA LLC, do you know what that refers to?
I would be speculative.
Don't
Okay, I
speculate.
don't want you to do that. Okay. Can you tell the jury what date is the check made out?
It appears to be May 9, 2012,
And what is the amount of the check?
$250,000.
And can you tell the jury that check, how did it fit into your analysis with respect to how Mr. McIver was treating the farm?
This was the amount that I mentioned.
That's the amount you mentioned that did what?
It was included as part of farm income in Mr. McIver's 2012 tax returns.
Okay. And when you saw that, can you tell the jury that 2012 year, when that check was written, is that the only year that you saw a significant amount of income generated from the farm?
Yes, and it was the only year that the farm showed a profit for tax returns that I was able to look at.
And for that tax year, how did you treat that $250,000 with respect to your analysis?
I'm sorry, objection to asked and answered. I think we went over that with the last slide. There was a footnote at the bottom that said he didn't include it.
When you say the last slide, meaning we're going to slide it a little bit, the one about farm income?
Yeah, Mr. McIver's tax shelter for ranch 2012 had an asterisk, and I thought Mr. Driskell told us, here's what the asterisk means, and it was written on the side. He didn't attribute that as income to the farm, so that's why we adjusted these numbers.
Okay. Do I ask him if that's correct, and we're done with that topic?
Yes, that was a great recitation.
But that demonstrates her point, that it was already discussed.
Well, but it's the first time we've seen the check. We
Okay.
talked about it, but I didn't introduce it.
Okay.
Yeah, I reduced the farm income by this $250,000 and accounted for it as ordinary income.
Okay.
Let me show you page 2 of your PowerPoint presentation that lists the documents that you relied and reviewed and relied upon. Can you tell the jury, did you also review documents with respect to Austin Agribusiness?
I did.
Okay. And now that you have looked at that document, which is page 2 of your PowerPoint, is your memory in any way refreshed as to what AALLC could stand for?
It certainly could stand for Austin Agribusiness.
I want to show you an exhibit. It is marked Stage 42. Okay.
Up to you, but no objection.
Okay. Being that there's no objection, I'll tender 482.
482?
Yes.
Okay.
Does that appear on your screen?
It does.
Can you tell the jury what we are looking at in stage 482?
Yes, I can.
What is it?
This is the closing of one of Mrs. Macgyver's brand bank accounts.
Okay. And what's the amount, well, first of all, tell the jury what date was this brand bank account for Mrs. Macgyver closed?
October 19th of 2016.
Okay. And can you tell the jury, if you could just read for them the check, because they see it up on the screen, but it may be a little hard for some of them to read, especially the ones in the back.
It's hard for me to read too.
Okay.
It says Linda Diane Macgyver, closed account, transfer to,
And it gives an account number.
yes.
Okay. And can you read?
It says transfer to estate account 8112789.
Okay. And what does it say over to the right? You make it out?
Per letter instruction from executor.
And on 10/19/2016, do you know who the executor was for Ms. Macgyver's estate?
Yes,
Who was it?
Mr. Macgyver.
And can you tell the jury what is the amount of the check that was transferred into that estate account per letter of instruction from Mr. Macgyver?
$269,228.19.
And in your analysis, did you ever review anything regarding the timeline of when Mr. Macgyver would have picked up his wife's ashes? Is that a part of your analysis?
No, it was not.
Can you tell the jury, as part of the work you did in this case, did you receive information regarding Mrs. Macgyver's net worth prior to her dating, or right after she began dating Mr. Macgyver?
I don't believe so, no.
Can we approach real quick, Judge? Logistical issue.
Sure. Because we'll have lunch soon enough. I thought about saying, let's just do lunch now, but I was reminded we might go a little while after lunch. So we're going to take our late morning break now, a new experience, the late morning break. I'll have Deputy Murphy try to round you up a little sooner than usual. The attorneys are going to keep up the discussion that we started there, and we'll see what's next for Mr. Driskell. So please retreat to your lair. We'll get you back out here soon. Thank you.
All rise for the jurors. Please be seated.
All right, Mr. Driskell, it's your break now too. Welcome to stay in the courtroom. Wherever you are, just don't talk about your testimony or anything else about the case. We'll get you back on the stand shortly. Mr. Rucker, anything else before the break?
No.
You're about to give me my lucky binder.
How about that?
All right, thanks. Ms. Clark Palmer, anything else? Okay, you guys will keep talking about this and we'll see where we get.
I wouldn't do that.